All right, thanks everybody for coming to our office. It's good to have you all here. Just out of curiosity, how much does this resonate with everybody sort of in their daily work, or do you think this is something new and it's kind of interesting, or just pretty relevant? Okay, cool. All right, so I think this is going to be a casual talk, by the way. For us, I guess being in a firm that's been around for a while, we've got a lot of legacy projects. Art started this firm over 54 years ago, so we've got sort of this history of going through, basically growing from a guy who started a firm, or wanted to start a firm when he was living in Queens and moved out to California, and that's basically Art and his wife Dee started this firm, and that's kind of the legacy that we all try to embody. And I think over that time, I've heard Art talk, and he's like, if I was in a garage just doing retrofits on somebody's residence, I thought I was going to make it as an architect. And like, now he's got this firm that does all this stuff. So for us, and especially in the digital design group, right, we're a team that supports the whole office. We see a large variety of stuff happening that it's really, we start to think about this as data and how do we capture this and how do we distill what's happening in people's minds sort of to this other whole level. So one question we started with is, should an architecture company become a data company? Like, should we kind of think about it like that? And I think the more and more we think about it, it's this day and age, yes, that's the answer. And I think that really leads us just to how fortunate we are, but I think it's also just that in every piece of this where you look, there's just more and more detail to it, right? So it's across different practice areas. We've got offices kind of all over the place, so there's cultural differences as well of how do different people in different places respond to different densities of space even. So you start to really think about it's not just the data of how do people operate in the space or what happens or the geometry of it, but all of that kind of together really becomes something really cool. So for me, the cultural aspect of how does it differ really starts to be an interesting problem to address and to think about. And that in New York, you can get away with 5 square feet per person and you feel all right, but go back where I'm from and you need 10, 20, and otherwise somebody's too close. And how do you start to think about these different parameters and how do you look at the models or even the performers and the data that's going into those models to start to justify how it forms and how it shapes and how people operate in it and how all that sort of gets tied together. And then you've got across the practice areas, right? That's what we call them, or the sectors, right? You've got sort of education, you've got culture, you've got arts, you've got workplace, you've got hospitals, entertainment, arts and culture, sort of sports venues, all of those different sort of types of space are made for different purposes. So then you've got different sort of traffic flow data, you've got different density data, you've got different sort of circulation pieces. There's just so much to it that I think it's really fun to start to think about it, like distilling it down. So in an overall aspect, you've got this design feedback loop that we're all very familiar with that usually we put to a project or to a site or maybe to a campus. And you're really looking at what's the problem, how do we investigate that problem, how do we think through the different options, what do we create, and we evaluate that, right? So for the potter, it's kind of this up and down, and I'm continually sculpting, and it's a very intuitive thing. You're seeing it with your eyes, you're feeling it with your hands, you're sculpting the clay, you're kind of defining what this is and investigating what happens, which is very analogous to what we do as architects and designers every day. But underneath that, what you're really doing is comprehending all these different bits about how fast is it going, how much mass do I have, what's the speed, you know, do I need to put more water on the clay, all these different aspects. You're really looking at very tangible type data. It's just buried in the design process of it. You're not thinking about that because it's very intuitive. So to me, there's an absolute direct relationship through all of this, and that's sort of how I approach this, because I'm still like to think of myself as a designery architect. So with all that said, and sort of the data that we're looking at, one thing that we did so we've been in this office now for 2 years. We moved over from Rockefeller Center, and what we did when we moved over here was we put in some overhead sensors that you can see poking out of the ceiling. We originally put those sensors in just to control the lights and to deal with our energy consumption and to mitigate that. But we actually happened to get this company that put these lights in. These sensors do a bit more than that. So they look at the lighting levels, they look at the temperature as well as the occupancy, and reporting out the plug load. So what we were able to do is sort of say, okay, we've got these things for energy use. But then after the fact, we kind of went back and said, what else can we do with all the data that's coming off of these sensors? And really, it was us designing an experiment to validate that and look at that data. So I think for us, I mean, the number one lesson was like, know the purpose of what you're putting in because it's not always going to be what you need it to be when you get it out. But I think it was a really good investigation that I want to share with you guys, because what it did was it made us think about design in a new way, and that was designing an experiment. And how do you validate that, and how do you build in all these checkpoints that you still need to build in for that sort of if you're looking back at the pottery thing, like how do you reevaluate and resculpt and look at it again? And we were actually doing that, but with the data that we were using and looking at sort of the metrics that were coming out of that. So first we looked at sort of what we've got and researching that and inventorying where that all is, and then validating that all the data that we did have was actually accurate, and looking at the formatting of all of that to get it to align so that we could pull in different pieces of data, and then creating the visuals and the analysis from that. So that was sort of our process over the year of looking at the first year that we lived in this space and looking at the sensors. So out of those 1,500 sensors that we've got across all of our floors, what we were able to do is submit internally. Gensler has research grants. So our research institute sits here in this office. So we were able to work with them and say, look, we want to investigate these sensors and see what's happening, because we've got to experiment on ourselves before we can look at using this in any projects. So we kind of just decided we were going to look at these sensors. And so over the course of the year, myself, my coworker Chang, and then our head of sustainability, and a guy who used to be in our IT department that's now in our consulting department, all kind of banded together, and we were like the little research team that looked at all this. So it was good to have different points of view. Some people are more engaged with clients, sort of had that conversation. So what we were able to do is not just look at specifically the data, but then also how do you translate that use of it to somebody else, and how to get them to understand what's the meaning. So the first piece of this was that we knew we had to look at why, because there was no single, just assign this task to this one team and they're going to be able to do it, because there was so much variable and so much of being able to get the API from the sensor guys to get the data out versus looking at what's happening in the space, to looking at the sort of sustainability and the BMS reporting and all of that. So we really looked at our firm-wide research group. We looked at all the external data sources that we had, plus our team, the digital design team, and then talking to the subject matter experts, being the sustainability team. And we kind of went through what do we need to do and how do we need to do it. And really that meant that we needed mixed methods. We didn't want to just take one, what does a sensor say, or what does somebody intuit, or what does the room booking sort of reservation system say about how the space is used and what's happening. So what we did is we opened that up and looked at sort of every method that we could to see what occupancy was, which we ended up looking at was the utility of the meeting rooms and how long people were staying in there, and if they were sort of booking it and then not showing up and that sort of thing. So the first step was really identifying all the different data sources that would help us look at that. And one of those is an internal tool that we already have, which is a surveying system. So this is just sort of somebody manually going around and looking at the spaces and documenting what's happening all the time. And that looks at the floor plan, and then we just basically grid that out. So I think one really important piece about the data is getting the increments, or you can like kind of hear your old math teacher talking about getting the units right. It's sort of that multiplying through all your fractions to get everything to work. But in this case, you're looking at the formatting of the data, because the sensors are just capturing, these are capturing a 10-foot radius around. So in open space, it's a bit hard to get. But then you're looking at individual desks. Is somebody occupying that desk? What are they doing at the desk? And then you're looking at meeting rooms, which is a bit bigger, and you've got multiple people in there. And are you really sure that you've got an individual count, or are you just looking at did somebody trip a sensor or not? Because it could be 2, 3 people. So getting all that kind of formatted. And then what we started doing is pulling other data in. So this is the WPI, which is the workplace index that Gensler gives as a survey after people move into their office. So once we moved in here 2 years ago, then last year we all took this survey that's just kind of after a year being in the space, how does it perform? So we had everybody's individual opinion. We went around with the survey, which is the previous slide, and we had blocked that out per desk. And then we were looking at what's happening. How are they working? Are they on a call, or multiple people standing around a desk and working together? and then really merging all that data. Here we're just seeing that there's a large uptick in these surveys. So we offer this as a service to clients so they can understand how people are feeling about their new space, and then we can sort of recalibrate what's happening after they've moved in if we need to tweak anything. So I guess what we're really seeing here over the years is from, I don't know, I've been here 7 years, so that's 2011 to 2017 and 18, it's just spiking. So more and more we're seeing that the clients care about the data and they know how to relate to that. And it kind of makes sense to me. Since we've even started doing all the VR stuff, it's like we're talking to bankers, we're talking to like midtown executives, right? Like showing floor plans and sections might not be the best way to communicate. Charts, data, VR, that's like we're taking what we're doing and we're looking at it in our method, but then we're kind of splitting it into the numbers in the charts, that's their method, and then we just put them in first person in VR. And those are probably two better ways to communicate all this than looking at plans and sections. To me, that makes sense why we're having better luck with these methods. And then we're looking at the energy performance. So Gensler signed up for AIA 2030. We're also part of the Paris climate change. So we've also got all that data that we're tracking across all the offices. And then we've got all our models and looking at all the data and what's happening in those models as far as head counts, type of work that's happening in that space, you know, all the performance metrics kind of tied to that as well. So from that, we're kind of merging all those pieces. So we've got in this instance, we've got the Research Institute, we've got all the workplace surveys, we've got all the New York open data as well. And then we've got kind of what's happening in our floor plan and in our plate and what we all observe, and also look at from the meeting room systems and the observation. So here what we were doing is plotting the different methods. So we were looking at the room reservation system, which is the blue line. We're looking at the sensors, which is the gray kind of background spikes. And then you've got the red overlay, or the pinkish transparent overlay. And that's the actual, what we called activity analysis. But that's the person walking around with the iPad once an hour. So you can see that every time there was, you know, this sensor was at that level when somebody walked by. So that's a true point of data. But then they didn't come back for an hour. So at that point, this spikes up. Or maybe they didn't come till an hour and 10 minutes later, and then you get that spike. So it's just the granularity of the data and getting that granularity to match up to, because otherwise one source will look like it was a lot more full, or there was less undulation, or people are only ducking into meeting rooms for half an hour versus the hour that they booked it for. So really getting all the multiple methods and then analyzing that tells a much richer and truer story than taking any one piece of information and taking that to mean that that's what happened. So for us, that was really interesting. Even looking at the sensors, we started looking at, the other thing we learned is pretty much that every dashboard is so-so and suspect. So we were looking at where the sensors are physically in real life, and then we would look at the dashboard and we'd see that the little icon was over on the floor plan from where we were standing under, which then means that all the visuals around the data that's coming out of that sensor have now just been displaced as well. So there's like a lot of different things that you have to check and validate and kind of question everything, I guess, is basically what you have to do to really prove to yourself that this is reliable and this is kind of the baseline, and then you can start building on that. So in this case, we started looking at the model. We were putting in where all the sensors were and how much overlap did we get. So in that case, we were just walking through an Enscape model in Revit, and we were actually looking at where the cone of the 10-foot radius on the That's every day. Don't worry.
We are conducting a test of the light safety system. Please disregard all audible and visual signals. This is just a test.
Right, so then we started overlaying all the different sort of times that the room was actually occupied, or occupied for the whole time, or left vacant, and kind of plotting that out, as well as looking at the activity analysis. So in this one, we're mapping what was happening at the desks, which are the little squares of red and green, to show if somebody was at their desk or not. Then we had the actual activities that were happening throughout the space, mostly our circulation space in the office. But able to see those on top of each other, and you can kind of look for different clusterings and different poolings of events or certain types of behaviors. And then what we did is basically stacked all those different items together. So there you've got the isovist and the mean depth map, you've got the enlightened, which is these guys, their dashboard view. You've got our own activity analysis, our sensor layout, all layered into the model. So we've got all these different layers that you can kind of look at together to get a better picture of what's happening. You could also do the temperature, the light levels. We did the acoustics. It just kind of kept going. But in this way, we could look at different floors and different scenarios and really see the differences between that. So what we're doing now, so we have these sensors and we've kind of been able to map all this data. Now what we're looking at is which configuration of sensors is best for different spaces for different types of learning. So really going in and saying we need to figure out this, so we need to answer this particular problem, and then designing the sensing system to feed that rather than just saying, here's a sensor and what can we get out of it, which was what we did to start with, just to kind of get into doing this type of work. So it's really about creating that human experience and understanding how and what happens in the space. And I think this kind of data, because it is a bit universal, it can be very small at a local level of maybe a studio or a team, but it could go all the way to sort of connected cities and bigger place, and how do people go in between all the buildings that we design and looking at kind of the flow in between. So that's that bit. And now I will try to do Chang's bit, so this is something that we put together a little over a year ago, I guess. So there's a bit of reference to some old stuff here, but I think the idea behind this is really cool in that if we do design with and kind of almost design for data, there's a much better chance that we're not just having to exchange models every 2 weeks. The idea here is that you're kind of streaming the important data to the different people that are also working on the project with you. So there's more of a feedback loop and more of a sort of collaborative process throughout, rather than having kind of this back and forth that slows things down. So we're really looking at acceleration. We're also looking at, in this particular example, it was data-based site selection around Fenway Park, and how the parametric modeling and data visualization helps to make better decisions and really sort of narrow the focus. Sorry, change in velocity over time. So it's really how quickly can we all look at this and work together and share what we're doing. Okay, so every 2 years. So what we're looking at is really the ability to distill down to simple data what's needed, and to keep the sort of the complex pieces on the other end. And really that's going to allow us to do things quicker and optimize the processing. So more options earlier for testing to make decisions about site selection, orientation, sort of alignment of the building. Also fail faster to weed out what's not required. Looking at the value, efficiency, and longevity of the design, and sort of being able to test against different scenarios, as well as the budget, and actually being able to account for and simulate different unknowns. So here we're looking at the inquiries as a driver to say, well, what if we did this? What if we did that? And we can kind of get those results really, really rapidly to analyze and make more decisions. And really then you can start to weigh the different sort of conflicting, or not even conflicting, but just the different parameters that all go into design. There's so much, and I think it's so hard to bring together all the conditions at once and say, well, if we do this, it affects this, 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 and this. Like, that's only increasing in complexity as designers and in our field, and also working with the engineers and all of their considerations and all of their knowledge. So the idea here was that we could actually just stream out to Arup, who was the engineer we worked on to do this, that we could stream out to them what they needed, and the rest of the model we didn't have to share. So they were only getting the lightweight version of what they cared about, and that was a set of agreed upon parameters that Gensler and Arup sort of define at the beginning, and then we're basically just reconstructing the model on the other end to those parameters. So in this case, it was a site selection. So we knew we had to go into Boston. We knew it was a 28-story high-rise, and that we needed approximately 250,000 square feet of mixed-use residential. So what we built sort of pulling off that data and looking at what specifically needs to be looked at. It was that we wanted to be within 5-minute walking of a public transport station, and that the actual site area had to be greater than at least 6,000 square feet, and that it was zoned for mixed use. So those were kind of the 3 pieces of data that we were pulling off. So we're looking at Analyze Boston as an open data portal. New York has loads too. Has anybody here looked through all that and seen? There's all sorts of cool stuff out there. Like 1,200 different databases that they've made publicly available. So it's definitely worth just filtering through.
Yeah, they just released 3D models of every building in the city.
That's right. They just did like a week or 2 ago, didn't they? Yeah. Yeah. So New York's like just busting with this stuff to play with and get into and just start looking at, which is fun. So we looked at ArcGIS, Rhino, Grasshopper, Addit, and Carto as a database to do this. So that's kind of the 3 buckets of how we pulled all this together. So first we're looking at Boston, and we're looking at 5-minute walk from all the transit stations. So that's something you can very easily grab where all the stations are and then say, okay, average walk takes us long, so that therefore you've got all your nodes. So now you've got all the properties mapped within a 5-minute walk. Then refining that even more, we're applying to those results, just pulling out what's mixed use zoning and then filtering that through so this site gets much smaller. And then 6,000 square feet of site area gets us down to a handful of spaces. So then out of all of those, they said we'd like to be next to Fenway, because who wouldn't? Right? I guess it's a bad week for that example. So it's really looking at how you sort of merge all these pieces and looking at the inputs, and then also in this idea, it's really synchronizing the users very quickly. This references Flux, but Charlie's here, so it's okay. It can be done other ways, just not quite as elegantly. But the idea is still just to pull out certain pieces of data and push that through, right? So in here we're looking at speculative massing model, and then looking at the glazing and the orientation and the siding of that. So we're looking at glazing ratios, glazing U values. I should really put myself on do not disturb. Sorry. Just close that. Right, so to get this and to get all those considerations for the performance of the building, what we did is picked out which queries we wanted to run on the model and which pieces we wanted to hold and which pieces needed to change, and to get that feedback loop going. So the glazing size and performance to the cost, wall construction based on the performance, and the total cost based on area, the HVAC based on cost, size, type of system, energy cost and savings, and turning that into premiums, and also tracking the lead metrics. So those are kind of the things that we knew as we looked at this prospect and this sort of sculpting of the building and what it needed to be. These are kind of the parameters that we wanted to keep an eye on the whole time between ourselves and the engineers. So in pulling that through, you're then looking at generating those queries, modeling all of that, running the simulation, getting the results, and then publishing the results online and getting that feedback loop kind of going from what was happening with the engineers to what's happening with the architects. So here you're looking at the architect just sketching things, and then the engineer actually running the analysis on all those variables and just seeing which ones work and which ones don't. So change. Should speed that up. So I think the cool thing about this too was that it was a system that was built across the offices, right? So that one person's using what the other office said, these are the variables and this is how it's going to work, and they're sharing that back and forth. So it's not we're running our thing, you're running your thing, and we don't know what's happening. There was kind of this common understanding of what's important to who and why, and working back and forth with that, but also then not overburdening everybody with all the other stuff that actually isn't necessary for one discipline versus the other. Yeah, so you don't want to show your client this stuff. No. But this they think is cool. So in here, you're able to then, it's Design Explorer or some other method, you're able to put in all the different parameters, and then you're actually able to see which ones are variable and which ones actually matter. So then you can actually even distill that more to what we care about as designers and what's happening versus what actually are the key metrics that the client cares about or that they can comprehend. There's 5 other metrics that we care about that kind of just get rolled up into one thing that is what you would actually communicate to the client. So in here, you're looking through all the different, we're looking through all the different options and all the different kind of strings that have been generated. And from that, you can see, okay, well, these top 10 met all the requirements that we want. So from that, then you have somewhere to start designing rather than trying to design to hit all those numbers without tracking them or without kind of comparing them all to each other even. So I think this is a really useful tool. I see this will become more and more the norm, especially for the skill sets that we have in helping the rest of our colleagues who don't have those skill sets to at least say, this is what matters to us, this is how it matters to us and why, and here's a tool that you can now start to design from rather than trying to get to this level by luck. So from this, they were able to tell that the payback would be less than 25 years. They'd get the 3 lead points that they needed extra, and they're looking at the EUI of being under 63 kBTU per square foot per year. So you're really able to fine tune some of the deliverables and some of the performance through this method, so you can really see, and also see the impact to the other variables. And also then, okay, well, these 10 different iterations all meet what we need to do. So from there, you've got lots of options about the differences that you can pick. So from that, you're looking at the engineer's process in the blue box there and publishing those results back online. So then they can run it, say, here's the results, what happened. Just pull that data back out. So you've got just Grasshopper and then an Excel table really pulling that into the architecture model, and you can sort of go through that whole loop the whole time. And then here you're also able to, so through this method, you can also share things that you wouldn't necessarily share. Like maybe you wouldn't give a whole model or a whole analysis, but if you have just the distilled data, you can actually even re-represent that to look at different methodologies of representation to communicate what all that data means, so that it's not, like you can kind of filter it graphically to mean something to somebody who doesn't understand what a different STC rating means or something like that. You can kind of, through color, imply what that means and why it's good or bad for their design and how that relates to what's happening. Yeah. Obviously, being able to share this back and forth reduces communication time, FTP time, all that kind of stuff. So you can actually just pull it in, look at it in your model, and do that as an overlay. So you're doing a much more digital coordination as in the streaming of data rather than in this whole file gets into this whole file. So I think if you start looking at our traditional workflow, most projects exchange files every 2 weeks, typically a week if it's a fast track one. So in that case, I'm making options for a week, then I'm sending you the file, then you're replying, that's another 2 weeks. So there's a 3-week window there of like response time, which I could actually just peel off an option and just send that without the rest of the model being a total mess. And being able to orchestrate that and have control over how we share and what we share at any point is really, really important, because I think it stops us going down paths that we shouldn't before. If you have 2 weeks to do up a bazillion design options, you will. But if you kind of filter those and get those per what's actually required and what the engineers need, you're going to have a much more focused and kind of tailored approach. So in this diagram, we're looking at really the opportunity for design input at the beginning, and concept design is quite high. And then the schematic design hits, and then design development, everything pretty much locks in and flattens out. So that window of collaboration, usually we're all working across the design and engineering world. We're kind of not in concept. We're like SD, DD, okay, everybody's going to start modeling in DD. It's like really we need that to come much, much earlier so that we're actually making informed decisions all together with all of our disciplines accounted for in a very accurate way. So if you look at that, then what we would say is in concept design, if we've got this kind of system, we can start collaborating and testing out different pieces of it the whole way through. So you can start with the big gestural moves and then dial it down into much more tailored and specific things about the space, about the systems, about individual fixtures and how that all works through design development a bit more. So you can do things faster, but you can also do them earlier, and that you can have those tailored for better outcomes, really. So then you're looking at picking the three. With this, we're saying that you could basically try to get all three. But that means there's a whole bunch of upfront work that we've all got to figure out on how to do this together. But that's kind of the ideal, or what we were trying to shoot for. That is it. If anybody has questions or if you just want to have a conversation.
Check online.
Check online. Okay. I can do that. I think I can do that.
That one. And chat. Nope, nothing.
Nothing.
Let me check in with Andrew.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about how, like, well, first of all the tool looks beautiful, and what you're doing is what I expect that designers should be doing, right? We're, at this point in time, we're the only industry that we're barely scratching the surface of this. Yeah. A few weeks ago, I heard that someone coined the term, we're not an architecture company or an engineering company, or we are an architect technology company, which is parallels, finance, tech, and all of that, where there isn't a single other industry that isn't taking advantage of all of the stuff sitting right in front of them. Certainly none of them are dumbing it down on paper. So my question is, with all these tools you showed us, from figuring out the site in Boston to the building optimization and then even the sensors, how are you integrating that from one project to the next? Like often, and let me sort of illuminate my thought on that. Often the stuff is you can get teams to create it for one-off stuff, and then it can get a little difficult to make it, generalize it, so it can be used on the next project and the next project. There's a whole process in that, and that's often where progress is.
There is, and it is true.
So, can you give me insight on how you handle that?
I can, and it's totally going to be a plug for my team, is that we are a team of 12 people that work across the whole office. So if somebody comes, either we say, hey, this is a cool thing and we think your project could use this, or you have the aptitude to run this, so here's something. But then we're also kind of empowered by our leadership to say, okay, you did this for this project, it was really cool, well done, but we tailored it, these 10 things are tailored for that project. We then have the space to take that back and kind of undo it and then rebuild it for a bit of a sort of broader reach. So
how is that going to roll out something that is a more general tool that other projects can use?
Sure.
What is the adoption like at that point?
It's a lot of personal relationship building, and it really does. I mean, it's all title data, but to me, all of this is about people and about communication, like all day long. So I think it's partly who has the aptitude really, or who can receive it at what levels. Maybe that's a better way to put it, and say, okay, we need to go explain it and be there when they run it, or there's some people, they just want to do it and they'll figure it out, and then we just check in that the results look okay. So I think there's different levels, and you kind of have to know who you're talking to. And then you also, I find myself more and more in this sort of translator role, where I used to be the person that just did it, and now I'm having to go explain it because other people want to do it, but they don't know what, or bosses want, like, in my studio we have so-and-so and they should do this. like, well, okay, but all daylight simulation models are not created equal, and this is why. So we end up with this sort of like, it's not a one-click solution ever. And you need the knowledge in the person's head to be able to execute this. So it's a lot of that. Yeah. Sorry, I think he beat you. But, yeah.
So did you find this type of workflow work with specific type of project or client?
I think it's more about the team doing the project. So if this type of work is for a specific type of client or project type, no, I really don't. And I did residential in Florida before I moved to New York, and I think that actually they were doing lots of optioneering and data management. They didn't realize that that's what they were doing, but they were. And I think it's also the exciting thing about working with data is that it is pretty infinite in scale. So you can get down to a very minute, like you can look at just a room and what's happening in just that one room, and there's loads of data if you look hard enough, or you could do a whole skyscraper and there's still loads of data. You can get into that. So at a room scale, it might be like exactly where do people walk, what's the temperature, what's like very fine-tuned elements of how like a surgery room is laid out maybe. But then you can go all the way to master planning and just the relationship of buildings and circulation between that and all the sort of environmental pieces that go with that.
Sorry, to relate to that, so if your methodology, parametric and data creation can be applied easily to different type of projects, have you noticed that workflow is part of the separate line item in the contract, or the project would be additional?
Oh, yeah. So the question is, do we see that in the contracts, and is it a stipulation? No. It's usually what we're seeing is somebody's coming and saying, we want to do a living building challenge building. And that means that we need to look at all these parameters the whole way through from start to finish. And then it's really about assembling a full design team, not just the architects, but everybody. And does everybody have the ability or the aptitude or the curiosity to work in this manner? And it's really how do we all work together that is the success of this. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
First, thank you. This is really, really informative. And I work with data a lot on my firm. My firm is very, very small. So we do all of this beginning work where we research the zoning and the landmarks and everything to really get all of our facts and our parameters to do something. But obviously we don't have that.
So do they have, so yes, so just to,
Yeah, I mean,
I think there's levels of it, and I think that if you have, or you have somebody that's willing to do it, so you might be working with engineers that are well versed in this, but then those guys might be on all the big projects, and then you've got the other crew that's not well versed in this. And I think it's really, one aspect is not looking at per project, per team, but how do you get this a bit ubiquitous, and you can start chipping away at it. And I think there's also, there's times that even us through computation have thought, like when we first started doing some of this stuff, we were like, oh, we can script that. We'll write your script for that. And the PM's like, no, you're not billing to my job. We're not doing that stuff, right? But what we would do is then look at that as an opportunity to still do it. And then we could tell a really good case story, because then we had the yes and the no, and we actually knew what the real facts were. We weren't speculating that, oh, this would have taken 20 hours. We knew it took 4. And then we gave it to the fabricators anyways, and they're like, oh, well, if we'd had that, the price would have been 40% lower because we weren't guessing about all this other stuff, and we just took the worst case and multiplied it by how many things you had. So I think there's always kind of an optimistic learning side to things that even if you're working with an engineer that doesn't, you say, okay, well, can you just distill this down to a layer in CAD that is for all these types of pipes, right? And then you can just take it into Rhino and pipe it or something. And then you've got something and you can share that back with them, and they've got something to share their boss. Like little moves like that can start to help pull everybody up, I think. And that's kind of where we started looking until we got to sort of a bit of a cadence. This is not happening on everything for us. So I think it's not to say we've got it all figured out either. We're just looking for those opportunities to keep pushing it little by little in different corners. Cool.
Any other questions? Okay.
All right.
Seems like we're done for the night.
Okay.
Well, almost. The one thing I forgot earlier in the intro,